Good morning. Today is the 23rd of ER and the 12th of May.
14th.
14th?
Yeah.
Really? Are you sure?
Oh, really? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, 14th.
We're on page 94. Parashat Bechukotai. This is one of the most important Maimarim in all of the Kotei Torah.
94.
94. And
we've done Bechukotai.
right.
Back to
It doesn't change the fact that it's one of the most important Maimar, even though we've done.
This is live with the times, live with the times.
Yeah, so we're going to live with the times. In Bechukotai telechu, if you walk in my statutes. The word Bechukotai here is going to explain, not in the literal sense, he's going to do a drush on the word. And he's going to explain that Bechukotai means two chukot. But chukot, he's not going to explain it as a statute, he's going to explain it as an engraving, like chakika. Mevo'al be'etz chaim. So he starts off very strong here. Right away, throws it straight into the sugya. It says in Eitz Chaim, in the Rizal's Eitz Chaim, here it says Shar Kafei, in our edition of Eitz Chaim, it's Shar Kafvav. It's the 26th gate. Perek Aleph. And it begins there with Rav Chaim Vital. From time to time, he interspersed his own personal notes on what he was writing. And he writes there, Inyan Tzelem V'amitit, Nira le'aniyut da'ati. The true nature of the Tzelem. And Tzelem we're going to have to translate in some way, right? Just so that people understand what it means, but it really doesn't matter because Tzelem can be like soul. It's a placeholder. Okay, especially since he's going to change the terminology in a moment. But the word Tzelem would mean something like the image of God within man. Tzelem Elokim. When God created man, he said, Na'aseh Adam b'tzelmeinu kidmutenu. And then it says, B'tzelem Elokim v'ra'otam. He created them with the image of God. Now, image is a difficult word because when you say image, you understand something that's like a picture. Yeah, a picture. Something has to do with sight. The word tzelem doesn't have anything to do with sight in Hebrew. There's no direct connection. I mean, today they took it in modern Hebrew and they made camera out of it, matzlema. But really, there's nothing that forces it to be in that direction. It could be something that's related to hearing, to smell, to anything. There's no clear indication of what exactly it means, except that it's a form of the same thing in some way. So he writes like this. Rav Chaim Vital writes like this. He's writing about what he's writing about, right? And he says like this: B'chinat Tzelem. What does the Tzelem mean? Shu b'chinat nefesh hasichlit. It is what we call the intellectual soul. This thing called the image of God, with which every human being is created, is what we call the intellectual soul. This is a tremendous statement, which is surprisingly not the first thing that people learn when learning Chasidus. Because it's such a major key to understanding what Chasidus is talking about, as we'll see. And it's almost, this was published at least 10 years after the Tanya. And in the Tanya, it doesn't seem to mention anything about this whole concept of Tzelem, which is very surprising also, because as we'll see, it's very, very central. Excuse me. But the big chiddush here, Rav Chaim Vital is throwing at us, is that he's translating, which is not something he usually does, between what one would call as the early Kabbalah, which was more based on philosophy than on the language of the Zohar. The Zohar doesn't have something called Nefesh HaSichlit. Neither do Chazal. The sages also, in the whole rabbinical era, there's no mention of something like that. This is the type of term, the intellectual soul, that the Rambam would use, maybe the Rasag already used. The Rambam, maybe Rasag, Rab Sadi Gaon maybe. But Rab Sadi Gaon already uses such a Beisod. He's coming up this week on Wednesday. His Yortzeit, I believe. And this is a real, for me it's a real treat because I really like dictionaries. I told you, you have to have a dictionary for everything and figure out what it meant in each era. So here he's giving a tremendous translation. He's saying, Tzelem means the intellectual soul, ha-mechaber ha-tzura v'achomer. And the role of the intellectual soul is to serve as an intermediate between the form and the matter. What's the form of man? The soul. What's the matter of man? The body. So the intellectual soul is what connects the two of them. So he's giving us a tremendous translation from Kabbalah into philosophy. Kabbalah is usually a lot harder to connect and to interpret realistically. Like, what exactly in the world are you talking about? Kabbalah is very abstract. But early philosophy wasn't abstract at all. It was talking about something that everybody understands. Everybody understands that they have an intellect. They understand what the intellect means. They understand how it's different than their emotions. And so you're telling me that the intellect is what mediates between the soul and the body. So you've told me a lot. You've said basically that what does it mean to be, what carries me alive? It's my intellect. And that's very interesting because you're not telling me it's my emotions doing it. It's a very interesting explanation. I mean, you're saying that not only that, but this is what it means that I have the image of God within me. And I have intellect. This is as far as this is what Rav Chaim Vital writes. Now, because if you look there, you'll see that he only writes this much. He'll write another sentence in a moment. But now, the Alter Rebbe interjects, and he explains in his terms, what does chomer v'tzura mean? What do form and matter mean? And he writes, Shehu nefesh elokit im nefesh be'emit. This is a very interesting change, right? Because you don't think about the animal soul as being just matter. You think it's the animate aspect. It's the animal soul. It's like the anima. It's what animates the matter. So, in a sense, he's probably including both of them together. But he says the form is what we call the divine soul, and the matter is what we call in Chassidus the animal soul. Okay? Levarer birurim. And so what does it do? This tzelem, this intellectual soul, as he calls it, as Rav Chaim Vital, and this is Rav Chaim Vital again, to clarify clarifications, to make birurim, meaning to elevate sparks, as it were, to bring things back to holiness. Why? Ki nefesh be'emit, so he explains why. This is from the Alter Rebbe again. Ki nefesh be'emit hi b'chinat be'ema pshuta. Because the animal soul is a simple animal. And it has no purpose or function. And you have to lift it, you have to elevate it, you have to give it purpose and function. So who does that? The Tzelem does, the intellectual soul. And now the Tzemach Tzedek interjects and he writes, okay, so we're not going to look at that right now. And now the Alter Rebbe explains like this: the intellectual soul is what we call the noga. So noga, we know that word from klipat noga. Right. But he's not saying that this is klipat noga. He's not saying that the intellectual soul is the impure husk of noga. And just to remind us, there are 4 husks or layers of impurity in the world, surrounding most things. 3 of them are completely impure. And it's like saying, lost cause, can't do anything with it. You have to let it fall to the side. And 1 of them is usable. It's useful. And so you call it noga. And this is the highest level before holiness. What's the parable that the Kabbalists usually use? Is a walnut. So they say the walnut has 3 shells that you have to break, and you can't eat them. And then finally, around the nut itself, inside the brain of it, there's a very thin shell which is edible. So that's like the noga. So that's when you say klipat noga. But he doesn't call it here that the intellectual soul is the husk of noga. It's not the shell of noga. It's just noga, which is a concept in and of itself. So what does it mean? Let's see in a second. The animal soul is the impure shell of Noga. We always say that the animal soul came from the good part of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which represents Klipat Noga, which represents the impurity of Noga, the impure shell of Noga. So it can't be that the intellectual soul will be the same. So it has to be that the intellectual soul is only Noga, it's not the Klipa. It's not the shell. So what is this Noga without anything? So he doesn't tell us here exactly what it is. But he does tell us about it something. And he says, "V'nefesh hasichlit ibchinat noga me'orav tov v'ra." It has a mixture of good and evil. So, klipa is one thing, and noga is something else. So when you say that the animal soul is from the klipa of noga, it's from the impure shell of noga, what are you saying? You're saying that it's predominantly a shell. It's not so easy that you can eat it. It's not so easily that it's usable. There's only small parts of it that are usable. Sometimes it's usable, sometimes it's not. It depends on the situation. There are nuts where the inner shell, like the walnuts, is not edible. And you have to break it again. So it really depends on the situation. But when you talk about just Noga, the intellectual soul, it says its problem is only that it's a mixture of good and evil. But then you have to understand the word Noga. What does the word Noga literally mean? In Hebrew, it means glow. Noga is like glow or glimmer. What?
What?
Noga.
No, what was the English word you used?
Glow. Like a Glow. What's a glow? Glow is that there's light, but there's some darkness in it. It's not entirely, it's like what you would get with sunset. That's when the Gemara uses it. The Gemara in Psachim, it says, Laila Nage. That there's a part of the night, the beginning part of the night, where it's still light outside, but you see the darkness coming on. It's after the setting of the sun, and there's no sun anymore. But it's still light outside. And because it's light outside, so mostly you can see. I guess we call it something like dusk. So there's a glow in the sky, you see the redness, you see enough to be able to see. But there's also some darkness mixed into it. As it says, there's a verse, Chachamim hem ale'ara, that their wisdom is used to do negative things. So what's it saying? That there's wisdom, and the wisdom is being used to do something negative. So we usually explain this. We say that the reason it's so, why does it just? It doesn't mean that it's all negative. It just means it can be used. Wisdom, intellect can be used to do negative things, because when the person is born, the mind, the intellect develops to take care of his needs. Right? That's why it develops initially. Why does a person begin to understand how to speak, which is part of the intellectual soul? Why do they begin to understand how to reason, how to get to a jar in the cupboard above, how to climb up and how to get down, or maybe not get down and get stuck and cry out because they're like 2 years old and they don't know how to do it yet, because they wanted the cookies. So that's called Chachamim Me'ara. It's called that they learn, they have wisdom in order to do negative things. Meaning, negative things here means not for godliness. It's for satisfying my own needs. So that is the origin of the intellect. Intellect rises, it grows out of the animal soul. So it has some negative in it, but it's not a klipa. You can never say that the intellect is some kind of impure husk. It's not. It's something entirely different. But it has its problems because it has some negative mixed into it. Okay, so that was the introduction. So now what do we have? What do we get out of this? That the intellect is the intermediate between the divine soul and the animal soul. So this is a very profound thing that, you would ask, why in the Tanya didn't you tell me this? I would think this is important to know. Now let me phrase it in a different way, and you'll see how really important it is. There's a question of who wrote the Tanya. If you don't understand that question, I'll ask it a little bit differently. Who wrote the Torah? Hashem wrote the Torah. That's the easy answer. The more difficult answer is, but it says, and God said to Moses, and God said to this, and so it's speaking about God, and it's speaking about Moses, and it's describing their interaction. So who's saying that? You can't, if it was God who wrote it in the sense of the same God that it says he said to Moses, then it should said, I said to Moses. Why doesn't it say like that in the first person? It says it in the third person. It's describing, everybody's described in the third person. There's no first person in the Torah unless it's a quote. Unless Moshe says, erase me from your book. So, but Moshe is saying that. Right? But who's speaking here? So we've talked about this in the past, I think. And the Ramban, Nachmanides, he writes that this is what we call Shlishi HaMedaber, the third person speaking. Who's this third person, he said? Who is this? So, it's a certain aspect of godliness. Who is it exactly? There's a lot to be said about it. But why is this important? Because by being like a third person observer, a third person, not the first or the second, not God and not Moses and not the Jewish people and so on, it allows you to look at things from a certain point of view. Now go back to the question of who wrote the Tanya. So obviously the Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya. What's the problem with that statement though? That the Alter Rebbe talks about the Beinoni, talks about the Rasha. And we have this concept, it's very well established, that in order to do that, he had to enclose himself in the very essence of what it means to be a Beinoni, an intermediate, and to be even a wicked person, even a Rasha. So he had to move himself from his status as a tzaddik, as a righteous person, and enter into their world. How did he do that? How could he do that? So the answer is he's also like using a third person. He's talking about the tzaddik, he's talking about the Beinoni, he's talking about the Rasha. Where's he?
On the outside.
On the outside looking in. And so who is he? He's like the third. Who is he? He's the intellectual soul of the Alter Rebbe. So he writes the book with his intellectual soul. Meaning the intellectual soul understands both sides. But now we have something very interesting, that he can't talk about himself. So he never really mentions, I think the whole intellectual soul is mentioned once in the entire Tanya. But we just learned that it's the intermediate between the divine soul and the animal soul. So who is this intermediate, this third person? It's the Beinoni himself. That's what comes out of it. That he can't call himself the Beinoni because then he couldn't write about the Beinoni. So he has to be like an intellect looking in from the outside on all of this. So in a sense, what this is saying is, and this I asked a lot of people, and the Rebbe Rayatz basically said this, that the I that we usually talk about, we pointed ourselves, we're talking about our intellectual soul. That is usually who we are. We identify with the animal soul. We identify more with the animal soul than we do with the divine soul. But the intellectual soul here is in the middle, and it's the one who's mediating between the divine soul and the animal soul. And so what is really the Tanya? The Tanya, which is like the let's step back and I'll explain to you what the Tanya was in the first place. The Tanya is a book of advice on how to mediate between the divine soul and the animal soul, how to be a Beinoni. That's why it's called the Book of Beinoni. Because I want to teach you. What? We just said it's a mixture. But it's not good or bad, it's just a mixture. Why? Because there's good advice and there's bad advice. It's sometimes, meaning it's not trying to do anything negative, it's not negative per se. So it's not klipat noga, it's not like its nature is to be negative. But it has mistakes. And so chachamim im le'ara. And because of that, he's acting in an improper way and doing something negative because he's serving the needs of the animal soul. But just as much, he could be serving the needs of the divine soul, which is what we're trying to move him towards. So this is just a beginning, and we're going to end here today. But it gets better and better. It just becomes, I think, if not the most important. This is more like a, you could say, it's a real reassessment of the whole Tanya. This mimer, and putting it in language that's Alter Rebbe. I don't know if he wrote this. I mean, it's probably from the Ma'aril, from his brother. He wrote it down, if I'm not mistaken. I'll look later also. But this is an incredibly important mimer. It's not very long, also, surprisingly. Here, can you take this?